Hello, and welcome to the Health Go Live webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Ropes and Gray. We would like to remind you that the chat feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions and comments throughout today's webinar. We would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Greg Levine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Greg Levine, a partner in the law firm of Ropes and Gray based in Washington, D.C., where I head our firm's life sciences, regulatory, and compliance practice group. I'm very excited to be here today and to be joined by two outstanding panelists. We have my partner, Lincoln Sang, who is head of our firm's European life sciences practice based in our London office, and Sonia Fulmer, Deputy Director in FDA's Digital Health Center of Excellence. Now, the title of our program today is Regulatory Issues Surrounding AI and Machine Learning Devices, U.S. FDA and European Perspectives. And although we will focus primarily on those jurisdictions, we may also touch on regulatory harmonization efforts that include some other countries as well. As stated in the introduction, please, if you have questions, we will try to take them. Please put them in the chat. There are actually quite a few attendees signed up for today's program, so if we don't get to your question, don't take that personally, but we will do our best to get to them. So with that, why don't we dive into our subject matter here? We will, I think in the chat, we're also going to put the definitions of AI and machine learning in there. I believe that's going to be posted, and you'll be able to see that. I personally found those helpful. You know, the two guys in the ties here are lawyers. You know, the non-data scientists, and I think we're going to presume that people know generally what AI is and what machine learning is, and we won't sort of repeat that, but those definitions are there for your convenience, which they come from the executive order that the president put out at the end of last year. So why don't we start off in talking about regulation of AI and ML. Sonia, if you don't mind, could you tell us a bit more about tell us about the Digital Health Center of Excellence at FDA, what it is, what it does maybe in general, and then specifically what its role is with regard to AI and ML regulation.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me today. As Greg mentioned, I'm Sonia Fulmer. I'm the Deputy Director for the Digital Health Center of Excellence. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in biophysical chemistry, and I've spent the last 10 years at FDA thinking about medical device policy broadly, and more recently on digital health topics. And so with the Digital Health Center of Excellence, we provide leadership, strategic direction on digital health policy and guidance, on innovation, technology, work on collaborations, and promote digital health literacy. The Digital Health Center of Excellence is an office within the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. We launched the DHCOE in 2020. We did this to further FDA's public health mission based on our recognition that digital health technologies, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, would present significant opportunities and challenges to our field. And this was driven by our ongoing commitment to advancing access to digital health technology. Our goal is to empower stakeholders to advance healthcare by fostering responsible and high-quality digital health innovation. So we find ways to tailor FDA's regulatory approaches to ensure that it's fit for purpose when it comes to these emerging technologies.
And with respect to medical products or software regulation within FDA, what is the role of your office as distinct from other parts of, say, the center? Let's just stay within CDRH.
Sure. So we work with our colleagues across CDRH and the entire agency, but one of our purposes is to ensure that consistency of product evaluation, regardless of the product type or which Office of Health Technology it's being evaluated in. And so that means that we participate in the review teams that are led by our colleagues in the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, or OPEC. It's actually a user fee commitment that, as part of a submission, you can ask for a digital health expert to participate on your review team. So we also lead AI policy development, for example, on guidance documents, as well as stakeholder engagement, lead our interactions with collaborative communities and other partners. And that's all to further cooperation on standards and best practices. But that means that we're pulling together work groups from across the center so that we have experts from different product areas and those that are participating on the review teams as well, so that we can collaboratively work together on each of those topic areas.
And what about with other centers within the agencies? To what extent is your office or CDRH involved in collaborating with the other centers?
So we take on a leadership role for the agency as well. We work closely with our colleagues in the other medical product centers, in the Center for Drugs, in the Center for Biologics, in the Office of Combination Products, to advance our understanding of the use of AI in medical product development. And so that means that, again, we participate on the work groups that are developing the guidance documents that you see coming out of those product centers related to digital health technologies. And we help them understand how, our experience in regulating AI from the device side can be leveraged in those product areas as well. We have been doing this for a long time in the CDRH space, and so we're hoping that our expertise can, help them as they get more and more of these types of products as well.
And then lastly, what about interaction with other government agencies other than FDA? Is your office, the center, the agency, as far as AI and ML, it's in the AI and ML area, what interaction is there with other parts of the government?
Yeah, we actually work really closely with several other agencies, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, or ONC, as well as our other HHS sister agencies like CMS, NIH, AHRQ. There's actually an example. A couple of years ago, we developed a tool with ONC and FTC to help mobile app developers understand what laws and regulations apply to them. And we've also done a lot of work recently with the VA. You may have seen last year, we had a challenge that we issued in collaboration with the Veterans Health Administration and the UK, actually, that tasked the data analytics community to develop and evaluate AI ML models to predict cardiovascular health in veterans.
Lincoln, why don't we turn to you, and maybe you can give us a sense, the UK and Europe as well, sort of what does the regulatory landscape look like as far as who is regulating?
Yeah, I think unlike in America, we don't really have a single agency overseeing medical devices development in Europe or European Union, whereas in the UK, the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, has a role in regulating medical devices. The peculiarity of the medical devices regulatory regime is that in Europe, as well as in UK, is the fact that the regulatory authorities are not directly involved in the product approval. It is a third-party conformity assessment undertaken by a certifying body. However, in Europe, the driving force for legislative and policy development is really driven by the European Commission, which has a role in proposing new policy and new legislation to be considered and adopted in the light of advances in the technological advances. For example, in the case of digital health, AL and ML, the policy and legislation usually come first from the European Commission, driven largely, principally by the desire to have a single market, internal market harmonization policy, as well as the public health policy and imperative to drive those new policies and new legislation to be adopted. For example, in relation to European Commission, the Commission actually has adopted 4 separate policy papers, and most recently in 2024, the European Commission adopted a Commission communication, essentially set out the vision of how AI and machine learning ought to be looked at and regulated, and how those new technological advances could be propelled for the benefit of the economy as well as for public health. Now, insofar as UK is concerned, again, the policy itself is driven largely by various governmental departments. The Department of Business has a role in setting out, for example, the broader AI strategy. The Department of Health and itself has a role in developing, together with the development business, the broader life sciences agenda, which include digital health. And the agency, MHRA, also has a role in looking at how AI medical devices or software medical devices ought to be approved, there have been a lot of policy papers and guidance issued by the respective government departments as well as the UK agency in relation to how AI and machine learning devices ought to be optimally regulated, and how one actually go about ensuring safety, security, robustness, transparency, accountability, fairness, and various parameters ensuring that there are good practices in place to ensure that the use of AI and machine learning are not abused in practice.
Thanks, Lincoln. We have one question from the audience, Sonia, on the US. The question is, who has the ultimate leadership responsibility for medical AI development in US agencies?
So each of the agencies have their own specific authorities. For example, FDA has the authority to ensure safety and effectiveness of AI-enabled medical devices, as well as, drugs, biologics that are covered by the other centers. There are other agencies that'll touch on AI-related medical uses. For example, the ONC, they have the authority to regulate or have oversight for certified health IT systems like electronic health records. And that authority isn't contingent on the definition of a device, whereas, of course, FDA's authority is contingent on whether or not a software function is a device. We apply our authorities, risk-based approach, if it's a device, regardless of whether the software function is deployed on a traditional hardware medical device or in an electronic health record. If the software function meets the device definition, it's regulated by FDA. But I will just point out briefly, and happy to touch on it in more detail later, that, for example, we work very closely with our federal colleagues in ONC and others so that our regulations that apply to medical products, are consistent with and complementary to regulations that are put out by ONC, for example, so that they're not overly burdensome or contradictory in any way.
And now we have a UK focused question, Lincoln. The question is whether the UK now allows FDA approval for pharmaceuticals and are thinking about it for medical devices. I guess maybe whether is the UK considering accepting FDA approval as UK approval would be news to me, but I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think it's a pertinent question. This is a question currently being discussed within the UK, and the MHRA has just published a consultation as to whether or not, like medicines, whether or not approval granted in other jurisdictions which have been considered as essentially trusted regulatory authority ought to be relied upon for the purpose of market access in the UK. So this particular proposal is currently being considered and within the UK, and in-depth consultation is taking place with the relevant external stakeholders by the MHRA.
Thank you. Okay, so let's turn to some of the specific questions with respect to regulation of AI/ML. And obviously, there's a lot of angles we could come at this from. There's use of AI/ML in drug development, but by far and away, at least for us as lawyers, the biggest question we get from clients is whether a software application that's being used in some healthcare setting is regulated by the FDA as a medical device. And this is actually, Sonia, you and I did an entire panel in a different meeting on this question of what's regulated, what's not regulated, and what's considered clinical decision support tool or something to help a healthcare provider make a clinical decision, but would not be regulated as a device. And as you well know, in the 21st Century Cures Act in late 2016, Congress carved out many kind of clinical decision support functions from the definition of a device, and the FDA subsequently came out with guidance interpreting that. And some aspects of that guidance have been controversial, including this language in the guidance stating that under this criterion 3 of the CDS guidance, that if the software reports that a patient may exhibit signs of a disease or condition, or identifies a risk probability, a risk score for a disease, even if that's not necessarily in a time critical sort of setting, that would not be exempt CDS. That would be a medical device. Just curious from you if you can provide any more color for us on how FDA interprets some of that language, and whether is it as black and white as it sounds? Is there some flexibility there? Anything you can tell us about that would be great.
Sure. And, as you know, Greg, this is a topic that I like to talk about at length. So feel free to cut me off at any point, because I'll probably just keep talking for a little bit here, because I know that this is a topic that a lot of people have a lot of questions on. So I want to just maybe level set to start a bit. As I mentioned, I think just a moment ago, we take a risk-based approach to the regulation of device software functions, and we focus on the specific functions of devices. That regulation is then narrowly tailored to the risks of those functions. And as I mentioned, it's platform independent, meaning it doesn't matter what type of platform the software function is deployed on. Again, from a general purpose computing platform to an electronic health record, it matters whether or not the function meets the device definition. And all of this is intended to promote innovation while protecting patient safety and meeting our public health mission. Now, you mentioned the 2016 CARES Act. That legislation built on our approach to the regulation of software. In addition to clinical decision support functions, the CARES Act also excluded from the device definition certain other software functions, including those intended for administrative support of healthcare facilities, those intended for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, what we sometimes call general wellness features, software functions that serve as electronic patient records, and those that are the medical device data system software, like transferring, storing, converting formats, displaying data and results. And I mention all of these because in addition to, our policies prior to 2016 that identified some low-risk CDS functions, we had a lot of policies that identified these other core functions as low risk as well. And what the CARES Act did is it codified into law that those are non-device functions, from those administrative functions all the way through certain types of low-risk clinical decision support functions. And it's important for us as part of, a predictable path to market that we are very clear about what those software functions are, which of those are devices and which aren't, because we really do understand that this has a big impact for companies, particularly for smaller companies and startups, which we see a lot of in the digital health space. And now I want to go back to, CDS, that's the topic area. We've long regulated certain types of clinical decision support software, and we have long identified that certain types of decision support software are low risk. In 2014, we had a PDASIA Health IT report that identified certain software functions, like those that provide reminders to healthcare providers or order sets or reference information. And the CARES Act took those and codified into law, 4 criteria that describe certain types of decision support software functions as non-device. But in the final guidance on CDS, we actually integrated that list from the PDASIA Health IT report of low-risk software functions into our interpretation of the criteria for non-device CDS. You see that in the guidance. But let me just briefly mention those 4 criteria to make sure we're all on the same page. You have to meet all 4, so let me start with that. And the first 2 talk about the types of data inputs used in the software's analysis. So device software functions analyze signals, patterns, medical images, while non-device software functions analyze medical information about a patient or other medical information that you might find in a textbook or a journal article. The rule of thumb there is if the doctor can have a hallway conversation about the types of data that the CDS is analyzing, then that probably meets the first 2 criteria. And then another piece that's important to keep in mind here is that we think of medical information as the type of information where the relevance of the information to the clinical decision being made is well understood and accepted. And the third criteria talks about the outputs, what a non-device CDS provides and to whom. It provides recommendations to a healthcare professional. It doesn't provide specific diagnostic or treatment outputs or directives, and it's not intended to support time-critical decision-making or replace the healthcare provider's judgment. And these risk scores that we're talking about fall out under this criteria. And then there's a 4th criterion that explains how the basis of the recommendations should be communicated so that the healthcare provider doesn't rely on the recommendations. Now, regarding risk scores specifically and software that may identify, that a patient may exhibit signs of a disease or condition, there's a couple points here I want to emphasize. The criteria in the CARES Act and the guidance that interprets it are not the only things to consider when determining determining the regulatory status of a software function. And so that's why we put together a tool called the Digital Health Policy Navigator. And that identifies key questions that you can ask about a software's function, walks you through existing policies, and points you to the appropriate guidance, sometimes to the appropriate page in that guidance, so that you can find its regulatory status. And you may find, though, that some low risk predictions fall out of FDA's focus because they're simple calculations that are routinely used in clinical practice. But on the other hand, we're seeing more devices use AI to identify complex associations that are not well understood clinical practice. And those would be the devices that we focus on. And I want to give just a quick nod to a recent example. You may have seen that we recently authorized an AI-enabled software device that aids in the prediction or diagnosis of sepsis. Sepsis is a serious and sometimes deadly complication, and this is a device. It fails the non-device criteria in the law, and it's FDA's responsibility to ensure there's a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for this device type.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. So I'll ask this question and you can choose to answer or not, but because there has been some pushback, actually considerable pushback, even petitions filed to FDA to revise some of the CDS guidance language, is the FDA considering revisiting that guidance at all, or is that set and not going to change?
So it's always a priority of ours to provide clarity to folks. And I think that, as we continue to get questions on it, and it's something that we got questions on prior to issuing the guidance, it's something that I think we'll continue to get questions on, and it will continue to be a priority of ours to make that clear. And so you may see, some additional clarifications from us.
Okay. And then as far as if I'm a software developer and I'm unsure, right, whether my software falls on, is going to be regulated as a device, or is going to be clinical decision support, or might fall within one of these other policies, I think I have an idea. Maybe I hire some really good lawyers from Ropes and Gray or whatever, I get my advice that way. But as far as getting advice from the FDA directly, right? I mean, there's the 513G process, which is for all medical devices, a very kind of a formal process. I make a written submission. The FDA, gives me a response, usually on how a device is regulated. But are there other more informal mechanisms to get feedback from the agency on these kinds of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly for this question of, I have a software function, is it regulated? Describe that software function to us in an email to digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov. I'm sure we could probably drop it into the chat if that'd be helpful. That is an email box that's monitored by digital health experts within the Digital Health Center of Excellence, and we aim to respond to those questions within a couple weeks. It's a quick kind of informal gut check almost of, where you're headed with your software function, what steps you might need to consider next if it is a device, maybe which OHT you might want to talk to. And we, can help you on your way and point you to the right guidance documents that you want to consider for making that determination. A good first step is for sure that Digital Health Policy Navigator. What you might want to do is start there. And then if you have some questions about like applying some of those policies to a specific software function, hit the Ask a Question button. It'll actually directly start up an email with the question number so that we know exactly where you kind of got stuck, and that'll help us help you.
That's great. Thank you. Do you know what the typical turnaround time is on those kinds of inquiries?
So we try to get most of them out within 2 weeks. Sometimes the average is closer to a week, but it depends on the complexity of the question. Sometimes we will seek out some additional input before responding, and that might take it a little bit longer, but I think it's safe to say it's faster than a 513G.
Yeah. Mike, and what about in the UK or in Europe, is this concept of clinical decision support or unregulated, AI/ML algorithms, and determining whether they're regulated as medical devices or not? How is that evaluated over on your side of the pond?
No, I think that the approach is very similar to what Sonia has alluded to. I think that really is about the risk base and impact on patients. And because this is an interesting time, that is the first time that the regulators would confront with at which time, which point of the data analytics journey that will be subject to the medicines regulation. If you look at the journey itself, it consists of the descriptive pathway, essentially identifying the pattern itself. Maybe it's a spreadsheet of some sort. Unlikely that itself would be considered as a medical device. And then you go through the next step of the data analytics journey in the predictive, analyzing the historical data to try to predict the outcome as to whether or not this particular person is more vulnerable, susceptible to a disease or condition. Then you're edging towards the small diagnosis type of device. And then obviously the higher risk area will be sort of prescriptive data analytics. Essentially, you're searching for the optimal way of determining as to what is the appropriate treatment. And these three steps will have different degree of impact on patient safety. And that's essentially, I think, what Sonia has alluded to on the risk-based approach in regulation. But in Europe as well as in UK, we have the benefit of essentially the case law, the European Court judgment on this area as to whether or not software ought to be regulated or regulatable under the medical devices regime. Obviously, not all the software used in a healthcare system or setting is considered as a medical device. The classification as a matter of case law is we have to take account of essentially two key principal parameters. One is the functionality aspect of the device itself in determining as to whether or not it does function as a medical device. And secondly is the intended purpose ascribed by the manufacturer as to whether or not this particular device is intended to be used as a medical device. Essentially, those are the key parameters driving the legal classification of software medical device.
Okay, thank you for that, Lincoln. Okay, so why don't we turn now from, we've been talking about this borderline, right? This line between software that AI ML software that is regulated as a device, software, AI ML software is not regulated as a device. Let's focus on the part where it is regulated as a device now. And you know, the FDA has reported that it has reviewed and authorized about 700 AI ML software products already as medical devices. That sounds like a huge number, and almost on its face, it tells you that because there's a lot of fear, we understand from software developers to have to deal with the FDA and bring their software through the FDA, but 700 products have gotten through, so it's not an impossible feat. That's not to say that it's easy at all either. Some of these applications, we see experience can take quite a while. But many of them, and we actually have a question, we've received a question from the audience on this too, and it was something I've been thinking about, is that many of those 700 have been in the area of radiology. I think it's something on the order of 70–80% of them have been using radiological images and to identify various anomalies, pathologies, and things. But you mentioned before, Sonia, for example, the new sepsis example. So I guess the question here is, are you expecting and seeing more growth in applications, AI applications that would be outside of radiology, or do you think radiology will always be 80%, but there's still going to be innovation in another 20% that will remain interesting?
Yeah, so I think that we'll definitely see a rise in the other product areas. I think the estimation there, radiology around 70% is about right. And we are starting to see more different product areas take on AI. And we in the center are, leveraging our experience from regulating the radiology-centric AI and applying it to other product areas as well. So you'll see more and more in, for example, cardiology, I think might have the second highest right now. And, we're expecting that to continue to rise as folks are harnessing the power of AI and how it can, identify those connections in other product areas as well.
The sepsis one, the sepsis authorization recently, that was a de novo, and that had a series of special controls that are associated with it. I think of the time, I don't know that we'd have time to really kind of go into all of what those are, but are there things that you might point out as sort of more kind of key critical aspects of, particularly these de novo applications and sort of setting the kind of special controls? What are the things that developers should be thinking about when they go into FDA that they evaluated and considered when they're presenting an AI ML application to the agency?
So I'll touch on a couple of things here. I think the first piece to keep in mind is that a successful submission is specific and focused. Where possible, you should use established methods that are familiar for testing validation. And for, particularly de novo products, early engagement with the FDA can be a really good way to mitigate many of the issues that may come up and really right-size your approach so that you're looking and designing your studies appropriately, and thinking about the right things early on. Looking forward, and to speak a little bit more, about the sepsis product as an example, I want to point out that, this is an AI-enabled device, and we'll see other AI-enabled devices where it's particularly important that they perform as expected in the real world. So one risk of a device like the sepsis score is model bias, or failure of the model to, adequately generalize to the actual population, and might result in ineffective treatment or diagnosis. Another risk is if the input data in the real world is poor quality or missing, and that could lead to delayed or ineffective treatment. And so one way to mitigate these risks that we see is through effective post-market management. So in the requirements for this device type that we established through special controls, we're asking manufacturers to develop and implement a post-market performance management plan that will ensure a regular assessment of the generalizability and device performance in the intended patient population. And so the plan then needs to include methods for monitoring the relevant performance characteristics and detecting any changes over time. Methods for identifying sources of performance changes during that real world use, and how you're assessing the results from that monitoring on the safety and effectiveness of the device. And so that's just, one example where we see post-market monitoring as one way to mitigate the risks posed by an AI-enabled device. We think of post-market monitoring as a part of the responsible deployment of AI-enabled healthcare product. And to enable that a little bit more, I think the next step is really looking at what kinds of infrastructure are needed to successfully monitor, what types of tools are needed, what the best practices are. And that's work that we're hoping as a community we'll be able to do together.
Yes, that is certainly one of the more interesting aspects of these authorizations. And for the non-data scientists among us, could you break, how would that work? So I have a data set, I develop my algorithm, I train my algorithm on another data set, and now I have certain kind of performance characteristics that I've established, right, for my software. Now you're saying that over time, I'm going to acquire additional data sets, and how is this post-market element going to work?
So I want to make sure that I'm not going to be too prescriptive here. Part of the way that the special control is set up is that there is some flexibility in, an individual device manufacturer to propose what their plan would be, so that we as FDA can say, yes, that will provide the assurance that we need that it'll continue to work in the real world. It's a little bit about, establishing, what performance characteristics are you going to be monitoring, so that if something, in the real world, as it's deployed in different hospitals, for example, may deviate from your expected performance that you established pre-market, that you have a way of noticing that, and you have methods in place to correct it. And that is, kind of like the high level piece of it, that you have a plan, and you're not just letting it out into the world without any sort of oversight.
Lincoln, what about in UK and Europe, or what kind of trends are you seeing as far as AI ML regulated applications, approvals? Are these coming through at a similarly high pace? Just anything you can comment on there.
Yeah, I think that the trend is very similar in terms of the pattern Sonia has alluded to in her presentation. We are seeing quite a lot of AI-linked universal diagnostic system, meaning that those systems are built to identify signatures for early disease detection and disease severity. For example, in cardiovascular disease area, and we just went through COVID-19. I think that we've seen those applications being introduced, and cancer area. The first AI software approved or subject to conformity assessment for CE marking is actually an AI device used to help in stroke triage, in providing much speedier decision to support a life-saving treatment being provided to a patient. As you know, for the clinicians actually in the audience will know that for stroke diagnosis, you have the two stages. One is the basic stroke diagnosis, looking at the neurological exploration, and then the non-contrast CT scan, and then we progress to the contrast CT scan, and then the endovascular treatment. But I think that for this particular AI is actually to obviate the need for the progress stage of advanced stroke assessment. Rather, is to use the non-contrast CT scan to predict whether or not the earlier treatment intervention ought to be introduced. Essentially, it's life-saving. I mean, but we see, in addition to this, we've seen quite a lot of AI being approved in other disease area like diabetics, cancer, early diagnosis, etc.
All right, thank you, Lincoln. We're already getting to a point where we have more questions than we'll be able to handle during our remaining time, especially because Sonia, you have a hard stop in a meeting coming right after this, but we're going to do our best. One of the questions is something I also wanted to touch on, which is the way the question is phrased here is, are all cleared and marked algorithms today locked algorithms, or any of them learning algorithms in the commercial or clinical care setting? And then what is the FDA and EU regulatory perspective on locked versus unlocked algorithms? And maybe this would be a chance, Sonia, to comment on the PCCP guidance as a draft. Maybe you could talk about whether that's going to be finalized, and then also some of the international harmonization efforts there with guiding principles.
Sure. So to answer the question to start, of the 700 devices that we've authorized that are AI enabled, that are currently listed on our website, those are all locked. None of them are continuous learning. None of them are generative AI based. However, the concept of continuous learning is one that we can see being addressed by the concept of what's called a predetermined change control plan. That is something that we actually were granted new authority for at the end of 2022, which helps us, make this device authorization process more efficient, because as you all know, AI and software really generally can iterate quickly. And we see a path forward for being able to predetermine what those changes are. So we've actually issued a guidance on predetermined change control plans for AI-enabled devices. The draft was issued in June of 2023. And so that's helping us, clarify our expectations for what predetermined change control plans are. And we are hoping to finalize that this fiscal year. We're also working separately on a broader draft guidance that will tackle the topic of predetermined change control plans for medical devices generally. But we are hoping to finalize the AI-specific PCCP guidance this year. But in a nutshell, the draft policy for PCCPs is that an authorized plan can specify modifications that, if they weren't part of the PCCP, would have been or could have been required to be submitted through a new marketing submission. So if modifications are made within the authorized predetermined change control plan, they can be implemented to a device without needing a new marketing submission. So that means that you're pre-specifying those changes upfront as part of your original marketing submission or a secondary one, and then able to make those changes according to the plan afterwards without coming back to FDA. Now, obviously, if you want to make additional changes that weren't included in the authorized plan that could require a new marketing submission, then you should follow our modifications guidances that help you understand whether or not you need a submission for those. But the draft guidance, it lays out what the components of a plan should be. You need a description of the modifications, the what, you need a modification protocol, the how, and you need an impact assessment. So the description of the modifications really lays out what the manufacturer intends the algorithm to become as it learns, including potentially for continuous learning algorithms. And it really draws this range of specifications around the initial device characteristics and its performance so that you can see that it's bounded. And then the modification protocol goes into how it will be done. while staying safe and effective. It should lay out, the protocol and the methods that you'll follow as the modifications are developed, how they're validated and then implemented. And then finally, the impact assessment piece describes the benefits and the risks of the modifications and how those risks will be mitigated. And it's important to keep in mind here that your plan may include several different modifications. And so you should consider the collective impact of the modifications if you choose to make one and not another, or if you choose to make them all. Again, all of this is done so that we can ensure that the changes, modifications are all done within, this framework of providing a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of those devices. I'll mention quickly, we did get robust comments on this draft guidance. We're looking forward to finalizing it quickly. Some of the comments ask for clarification on definitions of the terms we use in the guidance and ask for clarifications on expectations for things like separating test data or using test data from multiple sites. We also got a lot of comments and suggestions on the topic of transparency and labeling expectations, which we're very happy to see because this topic is really important to us. But I think generally my sense from the comments is that folks are happy with this concept. And we're seeing more and more companies thinking about how they can take advantage of it in their submissions.
And I've seen at least one 510K that had, predetermined change control program right there in the authorization. Should we expect more of these? Are there already more kind of coming through?
Yeah, I think we've authorized on the order of about 10 to 15 so far. We're looking at ways to see how we can make that information clear to folks so that which devices have received an authorized PCCP as part of their marketing authorization. And we're having tons of conversations with manufacturers about this, and they're exploring ways to take advantage of that opportunity going forward. So I would expect to see more for sure.
And then internationally, as far as the international kind of harmonization piece, right? There was a guiding principles document. Well, there were two, right, that were done with FDA, Health Canada, and MHRA.
Yes.
Right? And there was one, so there was one on good machine learning practices. It had 10 principles. And then there's one on predetermined change control plans that have 5 principles. And maybe because we run out of time, we won't go into all of what those are. But just out of curiosity, how did that grouping come together of those 3 governments?
So we work really closely with our counterparts in the UK and Health Canada and are aligned on a lot of these approaches. And, it's important to us as international regulators because we understand that it's important to the rest of the world to have harmonization on these topics. And so where we can provide, these guiding principles that we're all in agreement on, we think that will enable, better harmonization across the world. You mentioned the guiding principles for PCCPs as an example. This is a relatively new concept for a lot of jurisdictions, and coming together early on at the forming stage for this concept will help, I hope, enable all jurisdictions to kind of follow along in the same path so that we're not coming up with competing and contradictory authorities for PCCP. I don't think it'll really help any company to have one PCCP for the US and a completely different plan with modifications for Canada and then for the UK and then for every other possible jurisdiction. So aligning on these concepts early is, helpful to us and I think hopefully helpful to the companies as well.
Lincoln, and Sonia mentioned that in the US, the Congress actually legislated because although even before legislation, FDA had issued some predetermined change control plans. However, I think there was, would be greater comfort, and the feeling was it would be clearer that FDA had authority for that kind of plan if there were legislative amendments, which there were. Which granted, that authority, as Sonia alluded to or hinted at anyway, not only for software devices, but also for all kinds of medical devices. In the UK or in Europe, is there sufficient flexibility in the law already to have these kind of predetermined change control programs, or would this require legislation, do you think?
I'm not too sure there's a need for legislation because I think the framework is sufficiently broad and enabling to allow the, for example, in Europe, the European Commission and the medical devices coordination group, which is the advisory group advising the European Commission to promulgate implementing guidance to fulfill what is lacking in the legislative framework. That is the regulatory model which has been tried and tested not only in the medical devices area, but also in the medicines area, and has been pretty instructive and helpful, and also give the regulators the flexibility to change the guidance in the light of technological advances. The UK certainly at this stage of the process is not to legislate AI per se, but rather to develop good practices guidelines. And if there is a need for legislation, it will likely to be sector-specific legislation to be promulgated by for example, the UK will have to be either through the Parliament or otherwise that will have to find the power set out in the Medicines and Medical Devices Act, which is the primary legislation enacted after the UK left the European Union, for the ministers of government to enact secondary legislation to regulate specific issues pertaining to medicines and medical devices.
And then also on this topic of the international cooperation, there's also work going on, Sonia, right, that I think you're involved in through the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. Could you talk a bit about what that body is doing and what your role is in the interaction with the other? And that's a different grouping of countries, right? That's not now these three. This is what, Japan and Brazil and Australia and others, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a much broader grouping of jurisdictions in the IMDRF space. And, as FDA is co-chairing 2 work groups within IMDRF specific to software, probably more, but I'm focused on the software ones right now, if you'll forgive me on that. But we've got the software as a medical device work group that I co-chair along with Health Canada, and the AI work group for IMDRF that FDA co-chairs along with the UK. And these work groups are putting through a number of different work items. We are at the very tail end of a public consultation period for the SAMD work product on risk characterization. So that one is actually broad for medical device software risk characterization, which allows us to kind of have a harmonized language and considerations for what we take into account when we, as regulators across the world, look at software risks, and it's intended to help us, consistently describe those risks and, consider the different mitigations that may arise from those. So the comment period ends on May 2nd. So if you have any late breaking comments, please do send those in. We'd be happy to get them this week. And then we'll be working towards finalizing that this year before moving on to our next work items. And then the AI work group, we actually, FDA's hosted the IMDRF working meeting earlier this spring. And there they agreed that the AI work group would be tackling the topic of lifecycle management for AI once they complete this current work item, which is on good machine learning practices. It's a nice example, that one is, of how some of the trilateral work we've done with the UK and Health Canada can help us, start and then expand to broader jurisdictions. So we'll hopefully see that go through this year as well.
One of the interesting concepts that has been discussed lately, and there's been some publications on this idea, in the life cycle management, is have a network of assurance labs. That's been proposed to this group by CHI, I think it is. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because maybe not everyone's familiar with that. And is that something that you see happening, or that maybe that's just one idea and that there'll be other ways to manage the safety and reliability of these products?
It is certainly early days on that, but it is, one idea for ensuring patient safety. That's our goal, I think, and the goal for, the different partners that we're working with to advocate for patient safety. So we see that, the development of quality assurance practices can help ensure that AI is reliable, is ethical, is fair. And that relies on the use of high quality data in the development. And so an assurance lab, a quality assurance lab, can identify, an appropriate set of data and help manufacturers monitor in the real world as well. This is kind of like this quality assurance concept, to your point, is a life cycle approach, right? It isn't just at the development, but it should be considered throughout the total product life cycle of the device. Is something that you're going to continue to hear us talking about for software and AI in particular. But we really need all stakeholders to work together on these processes. The CHI group is one example of a partnership that we have, but it's not the only one. And it's something that, our strategy is to really work together with all the stakeholders that are involved in, healthcare delivery, right? It's not just the manufacturer, but, everybody that's involved in the life cycle of the product. So the vision is, high quality data, repository for high quality data that allows for a little bit of a democratization of data so that it's available for everybody to use, representative, well annotated data that will support their device development in a high quality way.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, we're short on time. Clearly, we probably needed 3 or 4 hours for this webinar if we really wanted to pick your brain on all the things that are really pressing issues here. I'll jump to one, and we also have some related questions that have come in from the audience. So the FDA published in March, a cross-center plan with CBER, CDRH, CDRH, CP working together, it's called. And one of the things described there is a draft guidance on considerations for the use of artificial intelligence to support regulatory decision-making for drugs and biological products. Has your office been involved with that guidance? And if so, is there anything you can tell us about it?
Yeah, so we are involved in the development of that guidance document. It is one example of how we're working together across the agency. All of our medical product centers are aligning on efforts to advance responsible use of AI for medical products, building on regulatory approaches that can be applied across medical product areas. So for that guidance, we're adopting a risk-based approach. It's anchored in the specific context of use for an AI in the drug development process. And it's consistent, with our experience so far on drug and the device side for various types of computational modeling, statistical analyses. So the draft guidance will describe a risk-based framework for using an AI model to address a particular regulatory question at various stages in the drug development process.
Another question we have that's sort of drug related is, so FDA has put out guidance in the past on PDURs. I was just trying to remember that.
Prescription drug use related software.
Prescription drug use related software, so software apps that sort of help, patients with taking their medication therapy. Are there other aspects of other kinds of digital technologies, I guess whether AI and ML enabled or not, that you're aware of that FDA is working on to sort of help in the drug world? Are there other things other than PDURs that are coming through?
So at the end of 2023, I think it was, we finalized the guidance on the use of digital health technologies for remote data acquisition in clinical investigations, and that applies to clinical investigations for all medical products, drugs, devices, biologics. And so that guidance relays some important information about whether or not a particular digital health technology is fit for purpose for use in a clinical investigation. And I think, might address some of that question in that, of course, an AI-based digital health product would fall into that category if it's being used to help support the investigation for a drug. And I'll just mention, that as part of our work here in the Center of Excellence, we do connect and serve on review teams for drug-related submissions as well. That's something that, I mentioned earlier, we provide consultations to our colleagues in the Center for Devices as part of the review team, and that applies to the Center for Drugs and Biologics, so that we can be providing a consistent approach across the board there.
So there would be examples where someone from your team or from CDRH would be sitting with the drug review team on a particular application where there's a digital health technology involved.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Interesting. A question we've gotten relates to use of data from outside the US. So the question is, in the development of an AI algorithm, does FDA require that the base sample for training the algorithm came from US patients, or testing sample came from US patients?
No, so, we do see products that are developed outside the US. Just one thing to keep in mind is that we are very focused on ensuring that the devices will perform adequately for the intended use population. So that means that the data that's used to develop and test the AI-enabled technology should be representative of that intended use population. That may be more challenging if we're using outside US data. And so we do think it's a good idea to talk with us about that early on through a Q submission so that we can all align on that approach.
Another question we have is how FDA is looking at the influx of mental health apps and software utilizing AI in the mental health area. Is that something where you have a particular focus or sense of what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we're watching as well. There's been a bit of change recently in the policies that affect that space, in that as part of the COVID-19 enforcement discretion policies, we had one for psychiatric use devices that are maybe CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy based, and that policy ended. We are looking to see how best to regulate these types of mental health products, and the added complexities of AI that are different than maybe some that were previously on the market that are more coaching, that aren't using AI, which may fall outside of our jurisdiction. You're probably familiar with our general wellness policies and things like that can provide a tip of the day, that sort of thing that can help somebody with their mental health. That's not generally something that we would focus our oversight on. But when we get into more complex AI-based chatbots, I think that does raise some different questions that I think folks should be careful with.
Okay, one question on this. I'll use this as a closing question because I think it's a good one. This is a sort of a what else question. So I'm going to ask for both of you, Lincoln and Sonia, this final question. What regulatory considerations are likely to emerge in the near term, 3 to 5 years, long term, 5 to 10 years, concerning AI and ML, and how might they impact the development and deployment of these technologies? So what do we see? What do we see going forward, right? You know what the challenges are today, but what do we see as being the future challenges in this area?
Maybe I'll just put in a plug for something that we didn't get to talk about today, but is on the radar for us going forward, and that we're hoping to provide additional clarity on submissions for AI and lifecycle considerations for AI through a new draft guidance document that I hope everybody keeps an eye out for, because we're hoping for even more robust comments, in part because you may know that a lot of AI developers are not familiar with the FDA regulatory process. And we really want this guidance to help people with that, so that it isn't a challenge to come to FDA and isn't too scary. And so I really encourage everyone to take a look at that guidance when it comes out and provide some comments on that one. And I'll pause there and let Lincoln have a chance to chime in.
I think that the thinking is very similar. I think that the challenge ahead of us is really how we're going to regulate proportionately the adaptive AI, which seems to be posing the largest risk. And I think Sonia mentioned about all these issues concerning control point. And I think the challenge is how we're going to regulate essentially this sort of self-learning machine, and how much scrutiny regulators ought to have, and what sort of guidance we need to issue, how often we issue the guidance, because very often for regulators, as a former regulator, one of the challenge for regulators is actually the regulation itself is not always keeping abreast with what's going on in outside world. I think those are the challenges faced by the regulators as well as for the industry, because without a clear, proportionate guidance, they do not know exactly what is the goalpost.
Very well put. Thank you, Lincoln. Yeah, obviously there's many other challenges we haven't even touched on today about use of data and how you access data, but obviously the data is the key to all of this. right, how do we have the benefits of this incredible technology and these amazing developments that are coming out without being the self-driving car that crashes into the pedestrian, right? Without having that managing that risk appropriately. So thank you both so much for the panel. The time has gone by really quickly, unfortunately, and we didn't get to everything we wanted to. We haven't had a chance to get to all the questions, but I hope that this content's been useful to the audience, and appreciate your participation very much. Thank you.
Thank you to Ropes and Gray and to everyone that joined us today. Please visit our website at community.hlth.com to catch up on all Health Go Live webinars. And join us in Las Vegas, October 20th through 23rd for Health 2024.